Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Mr. Ray McGovern about the Iraq War, its origins, the current situation in Iraq, and what might happen in the future. Mr. McGovern is a political activist and a retired CIA officer. He was previously chaired National Intelligence Estimates and prepared the President's Daily Brief. He's a co-founder of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. You can follow his work at raymcgovern.com and samadamsaward.ch. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Iraq-war. Ray, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
So could you give us a bit of background prior to 2003? What were some U.S. military actions in Iraq, and how did those actions lead up to the war?
Well, we had the first Gulf War, of course, early part of 1991, where George H.W. Bush retaliated for a very stupid move by Saddam Hussein into Kuwait. Now, the interesting thing about that war was that with 800,000 U.S. troops against a pretty weak Iraqi military machine, it became almost embarrassing to watch Iraqis try to retreat and become sitting ducks on the road to Baghdad. George H.W. Bush was smart enough to listen to his advisors, who Brent Scowcroft, his national security advisor, James Baker, his Secretary of State, who said, Mr. President, if you go ahead and try to take over Iraq, that would be one of the stupidest things you could do. So stop now, declare victory, and if you want, impose the kinds of sanctions that will ensure that Iraq will never become a threat to the United States again or ever. Now, he did stop, and he's been criticized for that, of course. Should have finished the job, should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein then. Now, the interesting thing is that we're in a period here, 1991, where the Soviet Union had fallen. Russia was being sort of inundated by people trying to make a quick buck from the West, and its military machine was pretty much debilitated. And what I want to tell folks is this, that with the United States riding high, with it known that not only Iraq had no respectable military, but neither did Russia, okay? The deal was this, that under the old Soviet Union, we never would have risked attacking Iraq and occupying it. The Soviets could not be depended upon to let us do that. But after the victorious campaign against a debilitated Iraqi army, Paul Wolfowitz let slip in a conversation with a high-ranking general named Wesley Clark, a four-star. 1991, right after the big victory, Clark was clapping Wolfowitz on the back, saying a great victory. And Wolfowitz said, it's not so much the victory over Iraq. The big thing we learned from this is that we can do these things and the Russians won't stop us. Whoa. Big, big revelation there. And that became known pretty much as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And what it meant was, and he actually wrote this in the Defense Planning Guidance just about that time, 91, 92, our strategy is to prevent any country from being a challenge to the United States military. We want to nip them in the bud. There can be no equality among great nations. We need to dominate, okay? Pure and simple. That was the strategy. So here we come, George W. Bush. Now, he comes into office 2001, and he's pretty tough. Well, he styles himself as a pretty tough guy. He's under the influence, and he admits it, of Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel, and he wants to show that he's tougher than his daddy. How better to do that? Well, go all the way into Iraq. And so he decides that he'd like to do that. From my more parochial point of view, the real scandal was that he suborned, he and Cheney corrupted, actually persuaded my former colleagues, CIA analysts, to become prostitutes and sell their souls by manufacturing, conjuring up, forging the kind of, quote, intelligence, end quote, that could, again, quote, end quote, justify an attack on Iraq. Now, that had never been the case when I was an analyst in the CIA. Here, all of a sudden, you have a corrupt President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and a mealy-mouthed fellow who wants to be on the big team. His name is George Tenet. He's head of the CIA. Bush and Cheney says, this is what you have to do. He comes back, and to their great discredit, he has a bunch of careerist managers, pretty much corrupted over the past 2 decades, ever since Bill Casey and Bobby Gates took charge. They would salute smartly, and so they did, and they composed the very worst national intelligence estimate ever on record, not only in the United States, but I know of none so bad. It was called The Continuing Weapons of Mass Destruction Program in Iraq. It was dated the 1st of October, 2002, and it was just what Bush and Cheney needed to persuade everyone but Barbara Lee, okay, and the representative from Oakland, to vote for a war against Iraq. Hillary Clinton famously led the charge on the Senate side and persuaded some of her fellow Democrats to vote for the war in Iraq. Now, what was the reason for the war in Iraq? How did they think? I was asked this very, very soon after it was found that there were no weapons of mass destruction. How did they think they could possibly get away with this? Justifying this thing by saying there are weapons of mass destruction, by saying that there are active ties, operational ties, mind you, between Iraq, between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, identifying the two, conflating the two so that, this is really important because of the way our media has become. Right before we attacked Iraq, 69% of the American people believed that Saddam Hussein had played a role in the attacks of 9/11. It was a masterful propaganda campaign, worthy of the likes of Joseph Goebbels. Okay. Anyhow, we went in there, despite the evidence that we could see that was it was conjured up, and it was seen to be conjured up. We sent as soon as, when I say we, I'm talking about veteran intelligence professionals for sanity. We're at work now on our 40th corporate memorandum. Now, over a period of 13 years, that only means 3 a year. So we bide our time, and we only pronounce ourselves corporately on very important issues. Our first one, the first one we sent to the president, was dated 5 February 2003. That, as many will remember, was the day that lives in infamy, so to speak, at least as far as Colin Powell is concerned, when he lied through his teeth, saying there were all manner of weapons of mass destruction. He talked about a, quote, sinister nexus, end quote, between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. He showed artists' renderings of those famous or infamous mobile biological weapons factory trucks or trains. And, it was just what we did was we arranged with AFP, Agence France Presse, the international news agency, to get a critique of his speech out on the wire. That's in the old days and the old vocabulary, by 5 o'clock that afternoon. Now, Powell spoke about 11, as I recall. And I was commissioned to do the first draft of this memo. And frankly, frankly, we were a little long in the tooth even then. And we were wondering, could we still do this? I mean, this was our stock in trade. Watching Gorbachev, watching Khrushchev, or even Stalin or Mao, you had to beat the newspapers. You had to do a little précis of the meaning of these things, analyze it before anybody got in print. And so we did. Now, we coordinated this thing, and we missed the deadline by 15 minutes, but AFP put it out anyway. And what we told the president was, look, just in case you didn't know, and we tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, Cheney is leaning all over our colleagues. They can't speak out, and they can't tell the truth. And Mr. President, this is a very dangerous situation. And we watched Colin Powell very closely all during his speech. And we have to conclude, and this was our concluding sentence, you would be well advised to widen the circle of your advisors beyond those clearly bent on a war for which we see no compelling reason and from which the unintended consequences are likely to be catastrophic. Period, end quote. We take no pleasure at all at having been right about that, but it was clear. It was very clear. We had no problem coordinating that among our veteran intelligence analysts. Now, that's sort of a corollary of that needs to be spoken. What kind of reaction do we get? Hey, you went out on the international wire, AFP. Well, I tell you, we had tens of people calling us in the next several days. Not only from France, but from Japan, from Norway, from Brazil, from Cairo. But curiously enough, not one media outlet from the old United States of America. Now, bear in mind, this is the 5th of February. We attacked Iraq on the 19th of March. So the fix was in. And have we gotten resonance for our subsequent pieces? Well, yeah, in the German press and in many other media, but not U.S. media. So when you talk about a blacklist, we were blacklisted. Why? Because we were right. Because initially they didn't want anybody to know that this was the case, namely that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and they just wanted to proceed in a kind of leisurely way. How did they think they'd get away with it? Well, very simple. Some of the leading neocons were bragging about this being a cakewalk, right? Now, this is going to be a piece of cake. I mean, after all, Wolfowitz said the Russians aren't going to intervene. We knew that because of the sanctions, the Iraqi had no military worthy of the name. And we'd just go in there and we would depose Saddam Hussein. And then when people say, yeah, but you claimed that there were weapons of mass destruction, we would just say, come on, sour grapes here. Look, we deposed Saddam Hussein. He's not a threat to anybody, especially not to our good friends Israel. We got the oil companies in there now. Look, sour grapes, man. Who cares if there are no weapons of mass destruction? Look, we're sitting pretty in Baghdad. Chalabi is our guy there. He's recognizing Israel. Come on. So all I'm saying is that hubris, arrogance, and the complete unwillingness to listen to reason, because what they wanted to do, they were going to do, can lead to catastrophic consequences. And when you look at the Middle East now, not only Iraq, which has been destroyed, not only Libya that has been destroyed, not only Syria, where 300,000 upwards have been killed, but places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, places like Somalia, and, it never ends. And who profits from all this? Well, I used to think, quoting Eisenhower about the military-industrial complex, well, that's a little hackneyed, Ray, for God's sake, that's, you hear about that in graduate school, all that stuff. But you know what? It's real. And it's not only real in terms of the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower wanted to say military-industrial congressional complex, okay? And they dissuaded them. They said, well, now, look, military industrial, that's good enough. Now, people are going to say that's going too far. So what he intended is really exactly what we have now, what he intended to say, that is military industrial congressional, and I would add media, and I would add security services complex. That's what we have now. The biggest new element there is the fact, well, let me put it this way. I've been in Washington now 53 years. That's a half a century. I've seen a lot of change, right? But there's one change that dwarfs all the others in importance, and that is that we no longer have in any real sense a free media. That is big. That could not be bigger. That's why the military, industrial, congressional, media, security services complex can get away with the things that they do because they are thriving on this kind of thing. And I would just add, if this sounds to your listeners like incipient fascism, well, do not blanch before the word. Go look up how Mussolini defined fascism in the classical sense. It's a sad story. We can talk more about this. Suffice it to add that after the attack on Iraq and things started to go sour, people did come to us, some people who were interested in the truth, and said, well, how do you explain what happened? And I developed this little acronym. I would say it was oil, and oil being an acronym. O for oil, I for Israel, because the Israelis really wanted to do what we did there, and I'll explain that later because it's a big thing. And L for the logistics of the thing. The military bases, well, we don't say permanent military base anymore. We say, what we say now, temporary or some military bases. Enduring, enduring military bases. At least that's what we were saying. After permanent sounded a little bit too obvious. Enduring, I don't know what the difference between enduring and permanent is, but I suppose, believe me, follows enduring young military bases. If it's enduring, then hey, let's go with it. So those were the tripod. Those were it. Now, John, what's his name? The Comedy Central guy, John
Stewart.
Yeah, he raked me over the coals. He says, McGovern, oil, you say it's an acronym? That violates the rules for acronyms. You know what you want to say. You want to say oil? That's not fair. You can't make it an acronym. He had a great thing. And you know what? I've come to realize that, I sort of, people say, no, it's oil. No, it's Israel. No, it's bases. I used to say, look, it's 33% each. But I've come around to the realization that it's about 25% oil, 25% enduring military bases, and 50% Israel. And I can document that. And if people are still confused, as they should be, about why the U.S. is in Syria the way it is, well, Israel is 90% in that case of the explanation. It's all written out in their documents. It just doesn't get into our fawning corporate media.
So we'll return to the lies and the real reasons behind the war in a few minutes. But I want to ask you about two somewhat unrelated topics from pre-2003 days. The first one is the airstrikes that continued under the Clinton administration and then the Bush administration in between the official end of the Gulf War and March 2003, Operation Desert Fox, things of that nature. And the second one is what the state of the country of Iraq was like prior to 2003 with the sanctions and with Saddam in power and with a Shia majority country having a Sunni leadership in the government. So can you address those two topics?
Sure. Pre-2003, was Saddam Hussein a brutal dictator? Yes, but no more brutal and many of the ones that have succeeded him, having been pretty much eased into power by the United States of America. What was the situation? Why was it that we kept bombing Iraq even after we had completely won the war? Well, it was a matter of a couple of things. First and foremost, because we could. I mean, hello, that's why we do a lot of things militarily, because we can. That's why we snoop on everybody in the United States, because the technology allows it. Now, we wanted to make sure that nothing untoward was going on in Iraq. In 1991, after the first Gulf War, all the weapons of mass destruction were destroyed. Okay? Now, how do we know that? Well, Scott Ritter, who is the chief UN inspector for Iraq, a Marine major. I mean, no slouch, Scott Ritter. He led the UN teams and determined that all the weapons had been destroyed. So what happens after a couple of years? Well, two of Saddam Hussein's sons-in-law, one of whose name was Hussein Kamel, they defect. They end up in Jordan. Wow! Now, why do I say wow? Well, because it was well known that Hussein Kamel was head of their rocket, nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare programs. Woo! So what did he tell UN and British and US interrogators as soon as they got to him? He said, don't worry, they've all been destroyed. This is 1995, okay? And what did they say? Well, yeah, how you know? How are you sure? And Kamel said, well, you know, I was in charge of those programs. You know that, right? Oh, yeah. Yeah, but how do you know it's destroyed? He said, well, I don't know how it works in the West here, but in Iraq, when you're in charge of a program, you order it destroyed, it gets destroyed. Well, yeah. But did you check on it? Not every site, but I did a sampling. Look, are you guys trying to tell me that? Well, what's the game here? You're trying to tell me they weren't destroyed? I mean, we have the transcript of that interrogation, and I want to tell you something really sad. Someone gave that transcript to Newsweek 2 months before the attack on Iraq. Now, Newsweek looked at it, verified it as authentic, and put it in that little section they used to have, the Periscope section, little article saying, wow, the transcript says that all the WMD have been destroyed. Wow. So that's the end of February 2003. 1st of March 2003, it gets printed in the printed form of Newsweek. So it's on the web the end of February. And what happens? Well, what we used to call the journalists in Washington, now I call them the stenographers, because what they write down what the government says, and they get that published, and they get 6-figure salaries. Well, they said, whoa, wait a second, we've been beating the drums for this war on the basis that there are weapons of mass destruction. Well, gosh, so we have to find this out, right? So where did they go? They went to the CIA, which always tells the truth, of course. What did the CIA say? Well, their PR guy says, this is fabricated, this is wrong, it's bogus, and it's untrue. In other words, he rolled out the tray that had all the pejorative adjectives for a news story, and he gave them all to the stenographers of the Washington Press. So what did they do? They said, oh, well, thanks so much for telling us, because we were going to write a story on that. Oh, good. That's how corrupt the whole thing is, okay? They never wrote a story on it. It was documentary evidence. It appeared in early March, so 3 weeks before, or almost 3 weeks before the war, and nobody paid it any attention because the drums were beating for war. So that's how bad it was in 2003. The other thing I'll say is that we had so debilitated that country during the first Gulf War. We had unconscionably attacked their water purification their sewage cleaning facilities. It was what we used to call war crimes. So Iraq was on its back. Worse than that, the sanctions that we imposed. The UN announced in 1998 that those sanctions were responsible for the deaths of 500,000 children below the age of 5. And when Madeleine Albright, President Clinton's Secretary of State, and before that UN ambassador, when she was asked by Leslie Stahl, do you remember? She said, "Well, that's a high number. Was it worth it?" And Albright said, "Yes, we think it was worth it." Well, that's not the America that I'm used to. That's not the one I served in uniform for 2 years. It was just so transparent that we had lost our moral compass, that we were going to do power over no matter what matters. So Bill Clinton's group was just as bad. Well, I think I exaggerate, almost as bad as George W. Bush and Dick Cheney in asserting U.S. power in a way that killed a whole bunch of people, including 500,000 Iraqi children under the age of 5. And the PR, the media here in this country, kept that pretty much out of the limelight. So we all thought, the American citizens that don't know and didn't know where to look for real information, we all thought that, Saddam Hussein, brutal dictator, just like Putin, bad guy. Sometimes had no shirt on, sometimes rides horse with no shirt on, bad Putin. People get inured to that, and then they say, well, okay, government knows best. And that's the real problem. The American people don't know what's going on. It's really hard for them to know what's going on because the same people that control the media profiteer on these wars.
It wasn't just Albright. Several years after that, Bill Richardson, who was a cabinet secretary in the Clinton administration, was on Democracy Now! They played the clip of Albright, and Richardson still said he thought it was the right policy.
Yeah, well, I can't answer for politicos who feel they have to say these things for political reasons, but I think any American recognized that was an unconscionable policy. Matter of fact, I'm a Catholic, and I'm not usually proud these days of the American Catholic bishops. But I'll tell you this, that in the year 2000, after it became known that 500,000 Iraqi children under the age of 5 have been killed by the sanctions, just by the sanctions, the U.S. Catholic bishops got together and called that, quote, unconscionable, end quote, the strongest word they'd ever used. Now, these were a lot of conservative bishops, but even they got together and said, hey, this is a just war and all that, because we can buy that, they say, at least they said then, but this kind of thing is unconscionable. So, very, very little treatment was given to that. Albright sort of said, well, she's sorry she said that, but, she never disavowed it. And that's the kind of country that we had already become before George W. Bush played on the horror of 9/11 to lead the country into an unnecessary war, which has caused chaos in the Middle East, and ended up last year alone in 1 million refugees arriving in Germany. 1 million, mind you. Okay, that's just Germany, and that's just last year. And our European, quote, partners, end quote, don't have the guts to hold us responsible. When I was in Germany last September, when the Flüchtlinge, the refugees, started coming in droves, there was all kinds of stuff in their major newspapers about, what do we do? Oh, should we be generous? Nobody asked the question, well, why are there so many refugees? Who caused this chaos? And we know who they are, but even the West Europeans were reluctant to put the blame where it squarely belongs. George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and I regret to say, their successors.
Yeah, and going back to the sanctions, it's just absurd that people think, we got to put on sanctions to hurt this country when all it does is hurt the poorest people in that country. Really, the people in power aren't the ones getting hurt by that sort of thing, and it's just such a tragedy to see those things happen. But going back to some of the reasons behind the war, and then I think we'll start moving on to the war itself. What were some of the alleged connections between Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, and Al-Qaeda?
Well, there weren't any. They hated each other. Saddam Hussein was an anti-religious figure. Osama bin Laden, of course, touted a nasty brand of Islam. There were no contacts at all, except those that were conjured up by people like James Woolsey, who had been head of the CIA, is an arch neocon, and has advertised himself as the leader of the Presbyterian branch of JINSA, the Jewish foreign policy APAC type organization. So it was James Woolsey and the British and others that conjured up all manner of stories. And, you know, if you doubt what I'm saying here, look back to right after 9/11. Now, there was a prominent CBS anchor, guy got out of Stanford, and he's, I forget what his name is right now, but I'll remember it in a second. He had Woolsey on 2 days after 9/11. And Woolsey said, we have to go after Iraq. We have to do Iraq now. And this very prominent anchor said, well, but Iraq didn't have anything to do with 9/11. That's all right. Doesn't matter. We have to go after Iraq right now. So there it is, all hanging right out of there, okay? On the evening of 9/11, and we have this from Richard Clarke, the anti-terrorism advisor to not only Clinton but early to Bush. He's in that big bunker under the White House with the president, first time the president's ever been there, with Cheney, with George Tenet, and Don Rumsfeld. And one of them, Clarke says it was Rumsfeld, when Bush says, now, we got to go after Iraq, Rumsfeld said, well, since Iraq didn't have anything to do with what happened today, it would be against international law. And Clarke quotes Bush as saying, I don't care what the international lawyers say, we're going to kick some ass, end quote. Now, that set the tone, okay? The next day, according to Clarke, who was there, he's in the Situation Room, and the president is wandering around in the Situation Room alone. That never happened. He's wandering down there in the bottom of the White House alone. And he sees Clarke, and he says, Richard, come here. And Richard, yes, sir. He says, was it Saddam? Was it Saddam Hussein that did this? Was it Saddam Hussein? And Clarke says, I looked at him with open-mouthed amazement. I said, sir, it's what I said, what I told you yesterday. It was Al-Qaeda. It was Osama bin Laden. Not, well, you check into that. You check into that. I know you're busy now, but you want to check into that, and you let me know about the links between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. Now, the way Clarke describes it, he went back into this little room where he had his office. There were a couple of his team there, and in walked one woman who worked for him, and she stopped in her tracks and she said, "What just happened here? You guys' mouth is just hanging wide open." And so Clarke described what had just happened. The president clearly wants to pin this on Saddam Hussein. That was on September 12th, 2001, one day after 9/11. So those were the parameters there. You've heard it said many times, Adam and Daniel, that after 9/11, everything, you can complete the sentence. After 9/11, everything
changed.
Right? Okay. Well, that meant, among other things, from an intelligence point of view, that whereas Condoleezza Rice said on Sunday TV on July 30th, 2001, that Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction, he had been debilitated, he had been unable to rebuild his army, he did not even constitute a threat to his immediate neighbors. Those are quotes, okay? Now, that's 6 weeks before 9/11. I have the clip. Okay, 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden, we're being asked to believe by Rumsfeld, Cheney, and of course Rice, who changes her mind, that weapons of mass destruction sort of wafted down from the heavens like manna, right, for a soft landing on the soil of Iraq, where God had that terrible mistake putting our oil under those sands. I mean, it was ridiculous. And anyone who did the most rudimentary research to see what Powell and Condoleezza Rice had said before 9/11, well, either they didn't write up the story by self-censorship, or they were told by their editors, that's not a wise career move to write a story that said so much variance from the collective wisdom that we're putting out here in the news media. So it was pretty bad. It still is pretty bad. And worse still, no one has been held accountable.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.